Joan by Carol M Mottershead, Chapter 10. We loved our time in England, especially during the reign of Elizabeth I. With few theatres and only a scattering of inns and courtyards as their source of entertainment, England was rich pickings for us. Elizabeth loved her theatre, but set so many regulations to control the actors that I remember William Shakespeare once saying that the arts are made tongue-tied by authority. Regulated actors weren't allowed to wear clothes above their station, which ruined the performances, nor were women permitted to act in their plays. They couldn't cover any topics that were too political, anti-religious propaganda, or with sexual references, but for us they were our main stock in trade, and the public loved it. As contrast, we wore all manner of colourful clothing befitting the characters in our plays, and women were played by women. Our anonymity was assured by the masks we wore, making it harder for the bailiffs or constables to identify us, let alone catch us, fine us, or put us in jail. Her Majesty had once been seen watching one of our jocular and bawdy jestings, and found herself laughing at our antics. A strong woman herself, she appeared to admire our strong female performers in our plays, but publicly she frowned upon us, leaving her with no option but to have us moved on. Eventually that was. We met William when he was a struggling young actor with a strong desire to be a playwright. He took every opportunity to talk with Pulcinella. "I like your style," he once said, whilst at the same time attempting to endear himself to me by openly flirting. Nicholas, who was always very protective, was standing nearby and overheard William teasing. It was so funny to see him standing there, fists in the air, challenging William to a fight. "That's my mother," he yelled, and everyone laughed. First, because they all knew William was just jesting, and secondly, because even at his full age of 25 years, Nicholas stood no taller than a wheel on our wagon. I stood behind him for protection, my hands on his shoulders, trying hard not to smile, for it was the most gallant gesture he could have made. But I had to admit it was such a funny sight to behold, and one that I will never forget. Nowadays, William Shakespeare is known as an actor, a poet, and one of the greatest writers of the English language. But when I knew him, he was a little different. He was an enthusiastic and prolific young writer, but he lacked the discipline required to write plays for the theatres, often coming into conflict with the Master of Revels, whose duty it was to censor the plays on behalf of Her Majesty. He would write politics, love, romance, jealousy, and human nature in all its raw states, only to rewrite them again and again before finally being granted a license to perform the plays. It was because of his style of writing that Pulcinella befriended William. They would bounce ideas off each other. Their differences were as amusing as their similarities, and many an evening would be spent vying for the most entertaining story each could tell. They both loved an audience. Both liked to make people laugh. Comedy was Pulcinella's trademark. William himself loved comedy. He just wasn't as good as he thought he was. He found it amusing to create his own brand of comedy through making up new words or phrases that were amusing to his ear, and to the educated man who could laugh at the incongruity of the words even if they didn't understand them. Pulcinella, on the other hand, has always been one for more visual humour that appealed to the masses. When he told the story of the Cocodrillo, it would become bigger and more frightening at every retelling. Exaggeration was his middle name. Despite their differences, William and Pulcinella became good friends. As time went on and the licensing became tougher, we decided it was time for our troupe to leave for Europe. where regulations were fewer. William had often complained about the numerous growing restrictions now being placed on playwrights, so we invited him to join us, but he declined. He had fallen in love with a beautiful young lady 3 years his senior, and had asked for her hand in marriage. "Stay till we wed," he asked, then cheekily added, "And maybe play at our wedding?" We did. He had become a good friend, so we agreed to stay. Now, as you know, I'm not one for gossip, but shortly before his wedding, William's plans were forced to change abruptly. Instead of marrying his beautiful fiancée, Anne Whately, he discovered his philanderings had caught up with him. Anne Hathaway, the 26-year-old daughter of a wealthy farmer, Richard Hathaway, was with child, his child, and her family insisted on William marrying her. For father's friends even paid the marriage bond of £40 to bypass the usual readings of the band's announcements and to ensure William would marry their Anne. Failure to comply would mean William would have to repay the bond money to the bondsman or face going to jail. A most persuasive argument indeed. Poor Anne Whately. Before we left England, William had one more favour to ask of us. He had become responsible for a young orphan boy he'd found hiding in a stable 6 months earlier. William, not a man of few words, insisted on relaying the whole long, drawn-out story to us of how he came to pass, and this is his tale. It was the end of a beautiful day in May, and the heavens had opened, and I had just taken a young maiden into the barn for shelter, and for what was promising to be a fun-filled evening, when we noticed a young child hiding behind a bale of hay. A boy. The child was exhausted. His eyes were filled with fear, hair and clothing soaked through to the skin, and holding tightly onto what looked like a dirty piece of cloth, which later turned out to be a homemade rag doll, the only thing the child possessed. Now most people think me a gigolo, a scoundrel and a wastrel, but I also have a kind heart. All intentions gone for the evening, my young maiden and I coaxed the child from his hiding place with offers of food. The bedraggled child struggled to stand, so I scooped him up and carried him to my lodgings, where my landlady, Mrs. Cohen, was always happy to help all manner of waifs and strays when she was in a goodly mood. But first she insisted he bathe and put on fresh clothing, while she prepared him supper. I, realizing that our intended evening of pleasure was well and truly over, took my maiden by the hands and kissed them, promising to meet with her the next day. She smelled so sweet. I held her closer and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and was about to kiss her lips when Mrs. Cohen called me from within. I told my young lady of the sorrow I felt at our untimely parting, and begged her to accept my heartfelt apologies. Smiling my sincerest smile, I blew her a lingering kiss as she departed, a disheartened maiden. Clean and dry, and wearing clothes that were several sizes too big, the boy sat down to ravenously eat a stale hunk of bread and leftover stew, as well as gulping thirstily on a tankard of wine that awaited him in front of a warm, welcoming fire. Once his appetite was sated, the boy was refreshed enough to speak. His name was John, and he was an orphan. He explained all he had been told of himself, that was, he was a baby when his family first set out from Africa in search of a better life in England, agreeing to work their passage as part of the crew. their dream of a better life, a better future, drawing them onwards. Unfortunately, this was not to be. John's parents passed away with a fever that swept throughout the ship, leaving few survivors. The few adult passengers that survived tried to care for the younger travellers as best they could, promising the children that they would be cared for by their own people when they arrived. Unfortunately, they were unable to keep their well-intentioned promises once in port. The authorities took baby John, with all the other orphan children, and placed them in the workhouse, where he would be cared for by one of the mothers. As he grew older, John was forced to work for a master he hated, and swore he would run away one day, which was exactly what he'd done. After hearing the boy's tale, Mrs. Cohen left the room silently, returning with a blanket for the boy. She allowed him to sleep in the kitchen in front of the fire till morning. Tomorrow would be another day, she told me. I had but one night to decide if I could help the boy further. As long as I paid for the boy's food, I could keep the boy in my room, she told me. But I could barely afford my own costs. I never wanted the responsibility of caring for another. I was just being kind. But the next morning Mrs. Cohen gave us breakfast. I tried to leave with the boy before she could say any more, but she caught us half in, half out of the door. There was no escape. John looked so helpless and was so grateful for my help that I couldn't just leave him on the streets to starve. So I told Mrs. Cohen I would cover the costs of young John staying with me, but told John that he'd have to work for me in exchange for his food, lodging and clothing. A young growing boy would need new clothes from time to time, an additional cost I could little afford. John was so grateful, he didn't even ask me what the work would entail, nor did he mind when I couldn't afford to pay him. All he asked was to be part of a family, to be acknowledged from time to time with a bit of praise, and to feel he belonged. I wasn't sure how we were going to manage, but we did. He's been like a breath of fresh air. I'm sure that boy has brought me the luck I needed, until now. So as a favour and a gift to a newly wedded friend, I'll beg you, please, take him with you. He is a bright young thing, a hard worker who takes great pride in everything he does. I hate to see him go, but I just know he will be a great asset to your troop, if you'll give him a chance. He looked over at Pulsnella, then at me. I could see that the boy was full of energy, a sense of joie de vivre about him. I liked him already. An asset to us, asked Pulsnella. Indeed. John wants to see the world. He's got a quick mind and loves excitement. Travelling with your troop would be an adventure for him. Besides, said William, he is extremely good at music and dance, and did I already tell you he's not afraid of hard work? After discussing him with everyone in our troop, it was agreed that young John would fit in well. Travelling as much as we did, it was indeed hard work, and we couldn't take on anyone who was a shirker. And besides, said Pulsnella in jest, he will make a more colourful addition to our plays. The audiences will love him.